The Supreme Court is out of control. We'll review its most recent actions and talk about just how afraid you should be. In the wake of the debate, President Biden has a big decision ahead of him. We'll talk about what it means for the rest of us as we all do our best to support Democrats up and down the ballot. Welcome back to the podcast for the 54% of Americans who regularly vote for progress in every election and want to convince their friends and family members to join our majority. This is Majority 54.
Well, Jason, that's the shortest rundown I think we've ever had, which means could mean this is going to be a short episode, but I suspect we'll have a lot to talk about on those two topics. Let's start with this immunity decision. And I spent the morning going back over this because I've been so much down the rabbit hole of the debate commentary and the future of the Democratic ticket, which we'll obviously talk about in the back end of this episode, the second half of the episode. And I finally came to grips about this case on immunity. This is way more sweeping than I was expecting. Now, I think on the face of it, this decision appears what we expected, right? When I first saw news of this, I said, oh, yeah, okay, there's carve out for, and I think we probably talked about this on the podcast, but we expected that there would be a carve out for official acts, and that they would distinguish official from unofficial, right? That's what we expected, right? And it seems like that's what they said, but they went so further. And so they took a pretty broad view of what an official act is, something we could talk more about. They got pretty specific about the actual allegations against Trump. They said that he cannot be prosecuted for his efforts to, quote, leverage the Justice Department's power and authority to convince certain states to replace their legitimate actors with Trump's fraudulent slate of electors. So they straight up said he can't be prosecuted for that because it was his conversation with the Justice Department. And I have a lot more to say about that. They said the presumption was that he can't be prosecuted for his effort to pressure Pence in his role as president of the Senate. But that the court could determine that he's liable there after going through their own process. They came to a similar determination about Trump's interactions with state officials trying to convince them to change their electoral votes in his favor. There were three related parts of this that I think are the worst parts of this decision. Number one, they made Chutkan, the district court judge, they made her fact finding on this immediately appealable, which even before that, this case was not going to be heard before the election, but this guarantees that it's going to slow it down considerably and gives them another attempt to kill this case. The court defined the outer perimeter of the president's powers extremely broadly. And the hypotheticals here that we were hearing in oral arguments about SEAL Team 6 and all that, now they're all real. And I suspect we'll talk more about that. And I think the most worrisome part of this was that they said that prosecutors can't just not charge an official act, which we expected, but they can't even introduce evidence involving an official act. And this is actually what prompted Barrett to concur in her opinion, is that she didn't want to be associated with that holding. This is the most dangerous, Jason, because this means that Trump can commit all kinds of crimes. And as long as he's like conversing with his cabinet about it or members of the administration, you can't use that as evidence that he committed a crime. That's startling.
This is the ultimate example of one party abides by certain norms and another party doesn't, and what the consequences of that are. Because technically, Joe Biden is currently empowered to do all of these things after the Supreme Court decision. Technically, right now, Joe Biden could order Donald Trump to be detained or worse for no reason at all, and it would not be a crime. Now, obviously, I'm not in favor of that. You're not in favor of that. Joe Biden would never do that. But we don't in any way think that that's something Donald Trump would never do. And so this is the natural extension of one party believes that the purpose of the presidency is to uphold the Constitution and to work for the welfare of everybody else. And the other party believes that the purpose of the presidency is to exercise power. and that elections are about gaining and using power exclusively. And that is why this is incredibly frightening. As a sidebar, the other frightening thing about this is that, over the last couple of days since this happened, I have referenced it in conversation with people who are not particularly political, but just referenced it, and they haven't known what I'm talking about. However, on 2 occasions, I have made joking reference to a viral video that's going around right now that's referred to as the Haktua video, and everybody that I mention it to laughs and knows exactly what I'm talking about. I'm not trying to sound like an old, man here who's just like, nobody's paying attention anymore, but that's kind of how I feel. and it is frightening that this is probably the largest expansion of presidential power ever, and in a way that is really frightening, that the current president of the United States and a dissenting justice on the Supreme Court referred to as making the president a king, and it's not even registering with people. So that scares me a lot. Here's what I would say that is the tiny possible, not silver lining, but the glimmer of hope that this isn't truly the end of democracy or that sort of thing. And that is this. 2 things, really. One, we've only had 2 presidents who I think beyond a shadow of a doubt would have taken advantage of this. And that is Trump and Nixon. Maybe there are others, but we only know for sure that there are 2 that would have. And then the other is that, by my reading of it, and tell me if you think this is wrong, while it does create an immunity from criminal prosecution for committing crimes as a part of official acts, what it doesn't create is a blanket authority to commit crimes as official acts. Meaning, if the president of the United States were to order the military to assassinate a U.S. citizen on U.S. soil, particularly a political opponent, that is an act that, though they may not be able to be criminally prosecuted, is not within the constitutional authority of the president. And so, it is still something where, anything like that, anything where you're stepping outside of your authority, where there could be a court that could step in and say no, including the Supreme Court. That is me trying to make myself feel a little bit better about this, but that's as far as I can get.
Yeah, the problem here is twofold. One is he has the pardon power.
Right.
So he can literally say, Stephen Miller, go out and, round up immigrants into concentration camps and kill them. And he could then pardon Miller at the same time.
Mm-hmm.
The second part of this is that Project 2025, this sort of collective Republican effort to remake government that they have helpfully published, and we should probably talk about a lot more, makes clear that they not only want to remake the government and have sort of sycophants in political appointed positions, but they want to remake civil appointees too, the people who are not politically appointed. So meaning the people who stay from one administration to the next, which means that they want to, when the president can do whatever he wants, essentially, which is kind of what this is saying, he can, steamroll all these folks, get in people who will do what he asks them to do. And Sotomayor, in her dissent, raised a bunch of hypotheticals and kind of building on the SEAL Team 6 piece. And then I was listening to Preet Bharara this morning, the former U.S. attorney from Southern District of New York, and he was on with a bunch of Republican and Democratic former prosecutors, and they were just raising different hypotheticals and saying, do you think this could happen now? Do you think this would be allowed? And basically, they came up with a long list of horrifying things that would be allowable under this precedent, including Trump discussing a conspiracy to kill his wife with his attorney general. Wouldn't be admissible, the discussion with the attorney general. Or having somebody as a member of his administration kill his wife, discussing with Stephen Miller to rob a bank, right? Like, these are things that would be totally allowable. That seems like a problem, Jason. Like, and I'm honestly, like, even as partisan as the Supreme Court is, I wouldn't say shocked, but this is shameful.
You know what? It was yes, it's shameful. You know what was shocking to me was Roberts going along with it. I did not think this would end up being a good opinion, but I thought it would be moderated by Robert's presence and like his sanity here. And it turns out he, you know, he voted with the majority. I think he wrote the majority opinion, right?
Correct.
That was shocking to me. And we shouldn't skip over the fact that these people are the folks who constantly justify everything by saying, well, it has to be in the text of the Constitution. And as long as it's in the original founding document, then we'll do it. And if not, we can't. And somehow they've looked at this document that is the result of a group of people throwing off the authoritarian grip of a king, and therefore writing a document, the entire purpose of which is to limit the power of the executive so that they never run into the problem of a king again. And what do they find in it? They find the immunity of someone to act basically like a king. That is, I mean, there's no good legal standard where you arrive at this stuff. I mean, you have to go out of your way to be playing politics. There's no originalism in this. It is maybe the most activist decision in the history of the court. And I think it should mainstream any conversation whatsoever, if it shouldn't have been already, and I think it should have been, about expanding the court. That we have to get to a place where we have enough power where we can expand the court. There's just no way around it. And I think expressly for the purpose, not just for limiting the damage of future Supreme Court decisions, but I think expressly for the purpose of reversing this decision.
Yeah, and it's going to be a tricky one to reverse, because then you need a new set of facts to go up. If I were on the Supreme Court, I would just start issuing advisory opinions, because there's no rule about how the Supreme Court dispenses with cases. They used to basically advise the White House, right? Like, so they would get on the call, and the Supreme Court justice would be on the phone with the president being like, yeah, this is legal and that's not, kind of like the White House counsel. So there's all sorts of ways they could do this, but obviously we'd have to get a majority, right? We could head in the other direction. If we lose this election, we could have this court and a more extreme version of it in future years. You talked about originalism. Two interesting things here. One is the guy who argued this case from the perspective of Trump is this guy, Ramon Martinez, who is my law school classmate, who, this is not going to be a shocker, Jason, arrived in law school fresh from a job with the Coalition Provisional Authority, where he wrote the Iraqi Constitution as part of Paul Bremer's team. Fun fact. A true conservative activist. These people, this is just a reminder that these folks have been on the farm team for a long time here. Second, there's this piece in The Atlantic by Akhil Amar, who was the sort of resident originalist at Yale Law School. And he talks about how unoriginalist this is. And for people who are listening, they're like, what is originalist? Like, this is like what conservatives claim to be, which is they're just arguing from the text of the Constitution, right? This is what they argue. And what Amar points out, and he was the favorite professor of all of the Republicans when I was in law school, right? Because he's the originalist, right? Amar wrote this piece basically saying, I don't understand what this court is doing. The only explanation I can find is that they're partisan. And the reason is, and he quotes the relevant provisions of the Constitution that relate to impeachment that explicitly name bribery, right? And then also say, in cases of impeachment, the party convicted shall be liable and subject to indictment, trial, judgment, and punishment according to law. Okay. And he then goes and says, well, the plain reading of this says that you are subject to impeachment and the law. Very clear point number one. Point number two is that they named bribery. Well, how do you prove bribery? Well, there's an official act, right? There's the quid, the pro, and the quo, right? And he says, well, you can have the quid, right? The money transfer. You can have the pro, which is that there's a pardon that happened. But what they're saying is you can't introduce evidence of the, at the quo. Yes, there we are. So you can't introduce evidence of that. And he's saying they are explicitly at odds with the Constitution here. and he's basically baffled by it because he seems to respect Roberts. And a little inside baseball thing here is like this is the reason why this is like one of the most like emailed articles in the Atlantic right now is because, and this is going to mean nothing to people listening to this, but when you're a professor at a place like that and all the Republicans want to come to you, there's this thing that happens, which is you become the person who send the clerks to those judges, right? So if you get the letter of recommendation from Akhil Amar, he has good relationships with the Supreme Court justices, so he likes to maintain that. The idea that he wrote this means that this guy is freaking alarmed, is what I'm saying, and that might not mean a lot to people, but it means something to me.
Well, probably because it's not just that this isn't originalist; it's that this is the very opposite of conservative. I mean, like, let's remember that what conservative means is it's the opposite of change. It's maintain the status quo. It's keep things as they are. It's if you're going to change slowly, right? Liberal would be the opposite. Progressive would be the opposite, right? So to say that after all the years that we've been a country, that now after we've had as many presidents as we've had, that suddenly it turns out that presidents have complete criminal immunity for anything they do as president. There's nothing even remotely conservative about that. It is certainly fascist in nature, but to say that it's conservative when it is such an enormous turn on a dime is absurd. Which is why I would have to think that a lot of real conservative jurists would feel the same way. I would hope so.
Well, that wasn't the only bad case, and we don't have time to go through all the terrible cases that they handed down. But there was this Chevron case. So this was another 6-3 rule. Well, by the way, I just want to on the immunity, Alito and Thomas both sat for that case. I refuse to let this go. That not only was this a blanketly partisan ruling, but there are two obvious partisans on this court. Obviously, I think more than two. I think if you look at just pick one, like Kavanaugh, the just straight up lie that he told Congress during his confirmation around abortion was such a political move. But so I'll put that aside for a second. The Chevron ruling, I mean, I think it's probably best to summarize it here and not get into all the inside out here and just talk about what it means. But essentially, basically our entire lives, you and I, like since 1984, there's been this precedence that basically said that courts defer to federal agencies when laws are passed. That says the agencies are the experts and they can interpret the law and issue rules according to their scientific and other expertise. And there's all sorts of language. Obviously, they can't just do things that are like diametrically opposed to the law or anything like that. But they have broad latitude to change with the times, right? Because like, what the telephone, the FCC and yada, 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 what they're dealing with in the 80s and today are very different. So the language of the statute is not going to change, especially with the kind of gridlock we have in Congress. And even if we had perfect harmony in Congress, it's just not reasonable to expect Congress to write new laws consistently to keep up with everything that's going on. They overruled that precedence. It's one of a gazillion precedents now that they've overruled. And in the 6-3 decision, they just undid it now, which throws, I think, so much of federal law making.
Tens of thousands of regulations.
Yeah. And what's funny, Jason, just extremely hilarious here, is that this court is just like, like they write these decisions and they're like, this is their move. They're like, everybody's overblowing this. This is not a big deal, right? This is what they're saying. Meanwhile, by the way, Gorsuch's concurrence is like cheering on this and be like, this is great. So they're not even on message with their own, but this is their move. This is what they do. They say, oh, this is what they did in the immunity case, right? They'd be like, oh, this is actually not a shocker. This is like a incremental change. And it's just, they're trying to say this was clarifying the way things always have been. It's so not on the level. I don't know even what to say about it.
Well, it potentially invalidates tens of thousands of regulations that keep us safe, that dictate fair business practices, fair labor practices, so many different things. And just to break it down, because it is hard for people to understand, the way it works is Congress, if Congress were to have every single thing that is the law or is a regulation come directly from Congress, it would be impossible to keep up. And it would also require members of Congress to be experts at a truly expert level, all of them in absolutely everything. And so as a result, the way that we have the regime of lawmaking set up in the United States, and the way it's been set up for a very long time, is that Congress makes a law and then delegates the authority to figure out the details of the law when necessary and pass regulations. And there's even a process for that, where an agency that wants a new regulation has to publish what that regulation is going to be. And then there's a period where people can come in and they can comment and they have to listen. And it's mandated that it's a certain period of time before that regulation can actually take effect. And then if they overstep, Congress can go in. That's what the oversight is for. And they can say, no, you did more than we intended you to do, or you did less than we intended for you to do. So we're going to make the law more specific by amending it, and then you'll have to comply with that. That's how it works. And actually, when you think about it, that's a pretty fantastic system when you have to keep up, particularly in a world where technology and everything else is changing so quickly. But now, in a world where we have Boeing, for instance, under scrutiny as to whether or not what they're doing is safe, whether they're cutting corners, whether we're in a world where we may have to regulate AI in the very near future, or probably already should be. And we have a Congress that doesn't have the attention span or the ability or the time, or even frankly, the relationships with one another to pass very many laws, particularly specific laws, particularly at a time when our politics demand that every member of Congress be a full-time telemarketer more than they are a member of Congress passing laws, where we're now saying essentially that any law can be struck down if it's not actually outlined specifically by Congress, and that the regulatory process is really, as one opinion put it, thrown into convulsive shock. And that is super scary. And it means that all of the dreams that Republicans might have about slashing all sorts of regulations to make it easier for oil companies to poison the water, or, I mean, you name it, they can just do it. For one thing, it's going to be an absolute bonanza for private prisons, which are if you haven't heard of it, that's a real thing, where there are companies that are private companies that are contracted by the state to incarcerate prisoners. And it won't be a shock to you that as they try to cut costs and make as much money as possible, they are for profit, that prisoners are not exactly treated humanely in every situation. I guess that they'll just have free reign, for instance. So yeah, the stakes are extremely high in this election.
Well, we could talk about this forever, and I want to make sure we make time for a discussion that I know a lot of our listeners are waiting for us to have. So we're going to take a break, and when we come back, we're going to talk about the debate and everything that has ensued since. We'll be right back. Lumen is the world's first handheld metabolic coach. It's a device that measures your metabolism through your breath. And on the app, it lets you know if you're burning fat or carbs and gives you tailored advice to improve your nutrition, workout, sleep, and even stress management. All you have to do is breathe into your Lumen first thing in the morning, and you'll know what's going on with your metabolism and whether you're burning mostly fats or carbs. And then Lumen gives you a personalized nutrition plan for that day based on your measurements. You could also breathe into it before and after workouts and meals, so you know exactly what's going on in your body in real time. And Lumen will give you tips to keep on top of your health game. This is really important. I've been running this fitness community for years, and often what I hear from people is, my metabolism is X, my metabolism is Y. But this actually gives you the data to actually confirm, or in some ways challenge, some assumptions you have about your body. And because your metabolism is at the center of everything your body does, optimal metabolic health translates to a bunch of benefits, including easier weight management, improved energy levels, better fitness levels, better sleep. And it could track your cycle as well as the onset of menopause and adjust your recommendations to keep your metabolism healthy through hormonal shifts, so you can keep up your energy and stave off cravings. So If you want to take the next step in improving your health, go to lumen.me/majority to get 15% off your Lumen. That's lumen.me/majority for 15% off your purchase. Thank you, Lumen, for sponsoring this episode.
This show is sponsored by BetterHelp. Have you ever scrolled through social media and felt like everyone else's life is picture perfect? I know I've been there. It's so easy to get caught up in comparing ourselves to others, especially online. But here's the thing. What we see on Instagram or TikTok is just a highlight reel. Real life is much more complex. That's where therapy can be a game changer. It helps you focus on your own journey instead of measuring yourself against others. BetterHelp makes it easier than ever to connect with a licensed therapist. It's all online, so you can fit sessions into your schedule without a hassle. Stop comparing and start focusing with BetterHelp. Visit betterhelp.com/M54 today to get 10% off your first month. That's BetterHelp, HELP.com/M54. Okay, folks, we're about to have this conversation about Biden as the nominee and about the debate. And a few notes that I want to start with. First, we recognize that not everybody wants to have this discussion and that there's a lot of fear right now because of everything we just talked about. And that fear is rational. That fear is not misplaced. And fear can be paralyzing. Ravi and I were talking on the phone earlier today, and I shared this story with him, and he encouraged me to share it with the listeners because to me, it is analogous to what's going on about in the party right now with regard to this discussion that we're having and how people feel about it. And that is, I remember there was this one day in Afghanistan when I served there where we had to go from one point to another, and we would usually take a vehicle to go that route. And it wasn't very far. But right before myself and a few other people were getting into a vehicle, we learned that there was, there at least had been a report that there was a suicide bomber on foot with a vest on, a suicide vest in the area, and they appeared to be looking for a target, a coalition, American, whatever target, to where they would detonate themselves. And so we were cautioned to be on the lookout for this. And so given that this was the case, I turned to the other people as we were getting into this vehicle and I said, hey, I don't think it's safe for us to stay in the vehicle. We need to proceed on foot. I was the highest ranking person. And so I, in a polite way, suggested, basically ordered, said, we're going to get out on foot. We're going to treat this like a patrol because then we could see the person coming. We could potentially defend ourselves. But if we're in this tin can vehicle, we won't be able to do that. So everybody complied except one person. There was a senior Navy enlisted person who didn't want to get out of the vehicle. And I had to argue with them about getting out of the vehicle. And it was clear that the reason for that was because they were used to being in the vehicle. And even though it didn't make logical sense to be in the vehicle, their fear was so paralyzing about their decision process that they didn't feel like they could move. And I feel like that's sort of where we are as a party right now. The fear is so understandably paralyzing that it's really hard for us to even have a discussion. I want to say off the bat that it is reasonable, entirely reasonable, and in fact, appears to maybe be the slight majority opinion right now, opposing the idea of Biden stepping down at all. What I don't think is reasonable is to oppose the idea of having a discussion whatsoever. Because if one debate won't matter in November, which is the argument that a lot of people are making, and I think it's a reasonable argument, it was one night, that's not going to matter by November, then neither will 1 week of discussing that debate and discussing how to move forward. So I genuinely believe, no matter what your opinion on this is, and Ravi and I don't have the exact same opinion, but no matter what your opinion on this is, I don't believe that it does long-term damage to the ticket for us to pause and discuss what should be done next, and particularly for President Biden to stop and consider what to do next. I also want to say that Ravi and I will absolutely 100% support the Democratic ticket no matter what, whether it's Biden, whether it's anybody else. There's no doubt about that whatsoever, that at the end of this process, when President Biden makes a decision, whether he steps aside or whether he doesn't, that we're going to be as all in as we've ever been, just as we're all in right now. Now, a lot of people have said to me on social media, well, why wouldn't we call on Trump to step aside? As if we aren't for that. I mean, I don't know how it's not obvious that all of us, everybody listening, everybody watching, Ravi and I, are in favor of that. I mean, not long ago, Ravi and I discussed the ethics of Democrats voting, for Haley and voting in the Republican primary, and we were in favor of it because what we said is anything that can be done to remove a criminal from the ticket should be done. And the fact is, this is a pivotal moment in America. And that doesn't make this discussion off limits. It makes this discussion crucial. So my ask is just hear us out. Give us the benefit of the doubt for a minute. We are not interested in, pretending that this isn't there and taking a don't look up strategy. We feel like that's what the Republicans do. That's not what the Democrats do. And then finally, before we launch into this discussion, I would just say that our views do not represent the entire MeidasTouch Network, nor do they ever. But I think it's worth pointing out. Now, with that said, Ravi, let's talk about this.
Well, thanks for that. I think I want to start with just a conceptual framework here, which is, do we all agree that there is the possibility, and you take Biden out of it, that a person reaches a certain age that makes it hard, if not impossible, for them to carry on the work of president? Like a good example is Jimmy Carter in hospice right now, or my grandfather, who's Biden's age, who recently passed away, but in his last couple of years was bedridden, right? I think we can all agree on the outset that at least at a conceptual level, that is a trend and phenomenon that we are all going to deal with unless we have an untimely death, and that there are things that you can't do over time that, and the list of things you can't do grows, right? Like Joe Montana can't play football anymore. Michael Jordan can't play basketball. Jimmy Carter can't be president anymore. Bill Clinton probably can't be president, really. Obviously can't because of the Constitution, but he's, if you've seen him lately, he's getting up there, even though he's younger than Biden, right? So we all agree, I hope, that age is a reality we all deal with, and it affects us differently. And it's the kind of thing that generally gets worse, not better, right? So that's where I'm starting from, which is that I hope, all agree that is a real phenomenon. The question then becomes one of a factual question that we are all operating with incomplete facts, right? Which is, well, what's going on with Biden? Like, where is he on that continuum? And we're trying to answer this question as the facts change because he's getting older, right? And so, what are we working with? And what conclusions are we drawing? People who are longtime listeners know that I've been saying for a while that I think that Biden was showing alarming decline. And I've been suggesting for a long time, since the beginning of the primary, that we consider somebody else. I probably said it in even more stark terms than that. Over time, I've gotten more alarmed. And over the past few months, I've been going on Lost Debate, and I can't remember if I've said it here, but pointing out to clips that I'm saying, oh, this response to the Hur report, Biden didn't seem on his game. This speech about Israel-Palestine, Biden seems to be worse. He's not giving a lot of off-the-cuff interviews, so we're not getting exposure to him when he's not reading off of a prompter. And then we got the debate on Thursday night, which I think everybody agrees was not reassuring. And I went back and listened to it a few times, and then I read the transcript too to just get a sense of how are we following the flow of this person's communication. And I think we can all agree that largely speaking, it was not coherent, and it was not coherent in a way that I think is quite alarming. And that has led to a cascade of behind the scenes stories, including one in the New York Times today, of people now starting to admit who are around Biden that things haven't been great and they've been deteriorating, including comments from European officials, et cetera. And we're starting to build a body of evidence that is rebuttable by Biden and his team, meaning they can have him do more unscripted stuff this week. They have chosen not to so far, right? They're putting stuff like the interview with Stephanopoulos later in the week and all that, but they have, I think noticeably not put him out there to do a long press conference like Jake Tapper suggested. There was a lot of reporting that he hasn't called a lot of his allies in Congress or anything like that. It's a rebuttable presumption, but what we saw seems to indicate that the decline is real. And we are Democrats. We are not Republicans. To quote Michelle Goldberg in the New York Times, she said, asking Democrats to show MAGA-style devotion to their leader is a dubious strategy, both ethically and practically. There's nothing to admire in the way Republicans have fallen in line behind Trump. It's been a moral catastrophe and has left their party a hollow shell that keeps losing winnable races. To pretend that Trump is fit for office, Republicans have had to give themselves over to corrosive denial. If Democrats spend the next 4 months, and then in a best case scenario, the next 4 years, telling people not to believe their own eyes about Biden, it will come at great cost to their credibility. So my belief here is that I'm a Democrat for a reason, and even if we don't all agree on this, that I am trying to be as honest with myself in my own eyes as I possibly can be. I'm not going to put my head in the sand. What I'm seeing is somebody who has reached the point where he cannot effectively communicate a message to the American public. I think there are all sorts of other questions about what that means, but at the base level, this means that this person, who I have a lot of respect for, uh, is not up for the task of taking us through this election, and that there's very real reasons to think this will get worse between now and the election, and certainly after the election, when he would have to serve another 4 years. And therefore, I think we should start looking at alternatives and respectfully urge him to step aside, and we should thank him for an incredible term in office where he's given us a lot.
I think that last part is super important because there's a lot of people listening to this right now or watching this right now who are outraged, who are conflating what you just said and hearing what you just said as something it's not. What they're hearing is you say something like, I don't support President Biden anymore, which is not what you're saying. It's not what you're saying at all. What you're saying is, in fact, he has been outstanding. He has done many things. I mean, not everything President Biden has done is something that I agree with or supported, but boy, the vast majority of what he's done has been incredibly impressive. And the question right now, the task at hand, is to continue this agenda and to take what President Biden has done, what he has started, and to make sure that it can continue, that it is not completely rolled back, and that the entire purpose of electing him in the first place, which is to preserve democracy and to keep Trump at bay, that was successful, and it was. And now all of that is at stake. And what I cannot, and there are people who are going to say, well, why are you even talking about it? Because it's entirely up to President Biden. Yes, it is entirely up to President Biden. And if we were Republicans, we wouldn't mention it at all, because there'd be no point in mentioning it, because the leader of that party would not care whatsoever what other people thought, because the leader of that party would do exclusively what he thought was best for himself. And that's what he's always done. That's not who President Biden is. President Biden is a person who ran because he thought that only he could win. And maybe he was right. And he thought that it was incredibly important. This is last time. He thought it was incredibly important to beat Trump. And so that's why he did it. President Biden is a person who I have spent time with personally, who's been very kind to me, to my family, to my career in the past, who I am invested in as a person. And what I have gotten to know about him is he will make this decision based on what he thinks is best for the country, i.e., he will make this decision based on what he thinks is best for beating Donald Trump. And what is different about Democrats and Republicans is that I think President Biden is listening to what other Democrats are saying about this. And I think that if we are not honest with ourselves and we don't have a genuine discussion, then I think we are doing a disservice to President Biden and therefore a disservice to the country. And I will reiterate that I do not believe that having this discussion for 7 days, if President Biden decides to continue and be the candidate, will in any way affect what happens in November, because there's a lot of real estate between here and there. And because if he ends up continuing as the candidate, I assume it's because he makes a bunch of public appearances in the next week and he nails all of them. And he reassures a lot of people, including himself. That's what I would assume would be the case if that were to happen. Now, with all that said, a couple of things that you said that I want to underline is the point about credibility. The reason that this matters so much in terms of candidates other than President Biden is because of what you were just saying, which is that when you look at, this is what the Republicans do. When the Republicans look at something and pretend not to see it, it hurts them with other voters and it hurts their candidates down the ballot. It's why when President Trump said that the election was stolen, and the vast majority of Americans looked at that and said, no, it wasn't. And certainly the vast majority of independent voters looked at it and said, no, it wasn't. It's why candidates who said, yes, it was, had no credibility on anything else that they argued. I have a friend of mine who's a trial lawyer who texted me the other day. He's a very successful trial lawyer. And he said, I argue for a living. I still do it all the time. And he said, the moment that I've lost my credibility with a jury is the moment that I've lost the case. Because once I've lost my credibility on anything, it means that they're not going to believe any argument I've made. So when I think about people who are running for the US Senate, running for Congress, running for governor right now, if we require them, if President, this is all assuming President Biden is not able to do something that reassures the American people. And now I know people will say, well, they voted for him in primaries. Okay, fine. I'm dealing with the polling numbers as they are now. I'm dealing with the numbers that show over 70% of people are saying that they're not sure about this, right? If we require our candidates to say to 70+% of the electorate that they don't see what the electorate sees, then what we're requiring them to do is to demonstrate the very definition of potentially being out of touch. And that is incredibly damaging to everybody running. And it's frankly not fair. And I think President Biden is worried about that too. And I think that's why he's thinking about this. The last point on this that I'll make, and why I am glad that President Biden is giving this serious thought, is that President Biden has done an extraordinary job. He, along with Vice President Harris, have pulled us out of away from the brink of economic collapse after COVID, have pulled us out of the pandemic, have made the economy, like, turned it around, put all of the proper indicators in the right place to where we are really positioned for great economic trends going forward, and done a lot of things for regular people that really matter. And that puts us in a position where, going into this election, I believe that we have, as Democrats writ large, the best case to make in a presidential year that we have probably had maybe in my lifetime. I mean, perhaps Clinton in 96, was maybe in a better position. I'm not sure, but boy, I cannot think of a time where the arguments on either side, where it's so lopsided, where, all things being equal, independent voters are so much more likely to go with us. And so that's why I think it is so crucial that in order to protect the progress that President Biden has made, that we have a candidate, regardless of serving in the office, that's a whole different conversation, but that we have a candidate who can prosecute that very excellent case as effectively as possible. And that's why I think it's worth President Biden considering whether that is him or whether that is instead, in my view, Vice President Harris, who, for everything else you may be concerned about with Vice President Harris, whatever your reason is, one thing we know, and I have the advantage of having spent a lot of time personally with her as well, is that she is an outstanding literal prosecutor of a case. And that may be what this moment in history needs. And that may be, I think is likely, what President Biden is thinking about right now.
Yeah. And I think we also have to acknowledge that we're not just Democrats, right? We're Americans, and we want somebody in the office of president who has the time and energy to devote to that cause. And I think what was clear, Biden took 8 days out to prepare for this debate. And I'm sure there was some presidenting going on during that period of time, but probably a lot less than normal, right? And the leaks that are coming out about when he's effective or not, or whatever, and again, we're all operating with incomplete information, right? So you and I both know people in the White House. We know what to confirm or not, but it's clear that he's keeping a lighter schedule, both internally and obviously with the press and the kind of stuff that he's doing externally as well. And his, campaign responsibilities are significantly less than people who've been in similar positions, right? So he's doing less campaigning and less presidenting, right? If he decided to make this move, he had more time and energy to devote to being president, which is really important for the American people, right? It allows them to smooth out that legacy. And it's important to mention what you said, which is, we feel strongly about his record, and the American people aren't voting for a president for the past 4 years. They're voting for a president for the next 4. And I think that pivot is really important for us, right? Is to say, look, we're grateful. There's a record to run on, but again, we also need to point the way to the future. And I think it's a really important moment, because when the American public looked at that debate stage, both participants, they didn't see the future. So, and you said this in a tweet over the weekend, which is the first party to show that they are listening is going to be rewarded. I want to throw some numbers in here. And look, there's no one poll that is going to be decisive here, right? And different people attach weight to different polls, right? I tend to look at the New York Times as the gold standard because that's what websites like 538 rate as like the most accurate, has been most accurate historically, and has the best methodology, et cetera. But look, people treat these things differently, but I think they have a place. The Biden team surely likes them because they put them in their emails when they confirm whatever the team wants, right? So it's like polls are important indicators to put together with a lot of other things, right? In this case, we saw the debate on Thursday. We knew what the dynamic was heading into that debate. And now we have more information, which are polls. There's another CNN poll that came out yesterday that I could easily quote right now that says basically the same thing I'm about to say. And polls are like, they check your intuition, because you could be like, I know somebody at the coffee shop who said this. But polls are actually asking a lot of people using somewhat valid methods to make it statistically significant, right? And generally speaking, they're within a couple points of what happens in an election. All right. All of those caveats to say, the New York Times poll that just came out, I think it was like an hour ago, shows Trump now leading Biden 49-43 among likely voters nationally, which is a 3-point swing towards Trump from a week earlier. It's the largest lead Trump has recorded in that poll since 2015. And he leads even more by registered voters. So that was likely voters. Registered voters, he leads 49-41. A majority of every demographic, geographic, and ideological group in the poll, including Black voters and those who said they'll still be voting for Biden, believe he's too old to be effective. Overall, 74% of voters view him as too old for the job, up 5 percentage points since the debate. Concerns about Biden's age have spiked 8 percentage points among Democrats in the week since the debate to 59%. The share of independent voters who said they felt that way rose to 79%, nearly matching the Republican view of the president. Overall, and here's an interesting caveat, more voters thought Biden should remain the Democratic nominee since the last poll, but only because more Republicans, perhaps emboldened after the debate, said they'd now support Biden staying in.
That's something. Look, one thing I want to say, I want to make sure people understand, is because people are going to say it's ageism, it's all these things. The presidency is different than anything else. My great uncle is 97 years old. And if you met him, you would never think he was in his 90s. You may not even think he's in his 80s. And he's a Broadway composer of great renown. He just finished working on a musical with Jennifer Lopez. And she talked about how they work together every day. And she gave an interview about it. And my great uncle is 97 years old, and he's as good as he's ever been at what he does. And I'm not comparing 81 to 97. What I'm saying is, like you said, everybody ages differently. It affects everybody differently. But what we also know is that the presidency ages people. And I just think it's silly to pretend that that's not the case. And to say that we can't have the conversation. Now, at the same time, because I have experience with people like my uncle, I'm entirely open to watching over the next week and seeing how President Biden handles public events. My hope, genuine hope, is that he goes out and he does like a 2-hour press conference and he just nails it. That would be awesome. If that happens, I'd be so excited. And I think it would be great for all of us. I think it'd be great for the country. I think it would be wonderful. But I think that if we don't talk about this, and if we don't weigh the possibility that this is the necessary step, and if he doesn't, then there's a real possibility that we look back and we say, wow, we really messed up. And I think there's a possibility that he might feel that way. And so I just want to be clear, like, there are people who are very mad that we're having this discussion. There's other people who've had this discussion. People have been very mad at them. I just think that like you said, what makes us different is that we are honest with one another. That's what it is to have a broad coalition as Democrats and to talk about these things. And I don't think that President Biden would expect anything different. And so that's where I think we are. And for those who are saying the logistics don't work, the logistics work. I mean, if particularly, and this is what I would advocate, if he were to decide to step aside, is that he would step aside and say, my vice president is going to lead the ticket, and that she would be able to choose a running mate. That would transfer the funds that have already been raised. It would also, I think most importantly, extend the opportunity to campaign on the very winning and impressive record that is the Biden-Harris administration. That is, to me, if he decides to step aside, that's what would make the most sense.
Yeah, there's one interesting part of this too, which you and I talked about earlier today when we caught up over the phone. Is like there's this assumption that we all act like operatives, right? There's this like you have to be on message. That's what Republicans do, right? When Ben Shapiro gets on his show, he talks like an operative, right? He obfuscates. He doesn't speak his mind. He basically takes his he takes his direction from whatever is going to help the Republican Party, right? That's not how we operate, right? First of all, I think this conversation does help the Democratic Party, and I do think it helps defeat Trump. Having these discussions really matters. But two, we're not flex. We don't get up there and say, if I'm in the White House, so you have to be really careful what you say, right? Like how you can't be floating random theories out there. You have to be extremely disciplined in your messaging. That's not what we do, right? Nobody would listen to this podcast if all we did was read off of, Biden-Harris talking points,
It would be pretty boring. And also it, most importantly, it would lack credibility.
It would be dishonest. And the honesty is the key part here. And this will be my last point. We have to be careful what we're asking our people to do here. So when I see the next generation of Democrats getting on TV, like Raphael Warnock, and saying, you know what, I also have a tough day at the pulpit, or Barack Obama's tweeting, comparing Biden's performance to Obama's 2012 debate performance. It lacks a certain credibility with the people listening to it, who are like, that doesn't seem to check out to me. That's what people in my life are saying to me, which is like, yeah, I watched that 2012 debate. That was very different. Or I've seen Raphael Warnock. I can't imagine that his bad sermon approaches anything like we saw on Thursday. They will also say, for the time being, I understand what you're doing, right? I get that you're doing a solid and you're trying to give time and grace to this elder statesman. But the longer this goes on, the more difficult positions you're putting your people on, which not only hurts those people in their political careers, and we should want them to succeed, but also hurts us down ballot right now in the states that we actually have to win in as well.
Yeah, I will end this discussion where we started it and where I started it the other day when I finally decided to say something. Well, actually, what I want to do is I want to tell people why I decided to say something. Because as a lot of people know, there's an Afghan family that's become part of our family because I got involved in getting my translator's family out of Afghanistan, and we're with them a lot. And, one thing that we really don't talk about hardly ever, because it doesn't come up because they have immediate concerns about building their life here, is American politics. But they told me the other day that they and a lot of other people in the Afghan refugee community are really scared because they saw the debate. And they're really scared that it means that Trump's going to win and what's going to happen to them. And I think there's an awful lot of people in this country who feel that way, whether you're a refugee, whether you're a woman, whatever it is. And I think that we somehow have gotten to this place where we're so scared, we're so needing to stay in the vehicle because that's what we know, that we want to tamp down that discussion of whether or not there's a different course to be had in order to preserve democracy, in order to make sure that, democracy can prevail, that we're afraid of the discussion when we don't recognize that we might be losing right now and we might need to adjust. And it's, so some people reach the conclusion that if we discuss this, it might cause us to lose. And other people reach the conclusion that we have to discuss this so that we can figure out whether a change needs to be made so that we can win. And that's where I arrived. And that's why I decided to say something publicly, is because I feel like I just can't sit back and pretend that I'm a paid operative whose job it is to go out and just go straight ahead. I don't work for the Biden campaign. And I just have too much respect for Joe Biden to pretend that he's not going to care about this as much as anybody else. Maybe more than maybe almost any president we've ever had, Joe Biden is a person who can set ego aside and do what's right. And all I want is for all of us to give him the space to do that. And maybe that's continuing to run. And if so, I'm all in. And if it's stepping aside and handing it over to the vice president to take the baton and continue, then I'm all in for that. I just don't want us to skip the moment and actually consider it. I think it's super important. So, all right, Ravi, we made it through this discussion, and we all are going to live to tell the tale. So, all right, thanks everybody for listening. You can find me and Ravi, where you may
can't
have
find
some
me
choice
anywhere,
words for us.
actually. Yeah.
It's at Ravi M. Gupta and at Jason Kander. I'm sure we'll hear from you. And thank you to the Midas Mighty. Remember, we all have a platform. Make sure to use yours today.